In this book, which I highly recommend, as you can tell by how many things I have sticking out of it, Dancing in the Darkness, Spiritual Lessons for Thriving in Turbulent Times by Otis Moss III, who, if you were with us last week, you might have heard preaching from our screen. He shares a story about Martin Luther King, that when he traveled, he was said to carry with him 3 books: the Bible, the Constitution of the United States, and Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. For those of you who aren't aware, Howard Thurman was a Black American who grew up in Florida during segregation. He became a minister and a philosopher and a mentor to civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King, and he was one of the great authorities on the teachings of Jesus and on nonviolent resistance to oppression. But all of that might not have come to pass. It might just have been a hunk of glass if he had not had a fortuitous encounter early in his life with the power of love. At the time that he was growing up in Florida, schools were segregated, and public education for Black children ended in 7th grade. Because there was no 8th grade, there was no demand for high school, obviously. If someone made a demand for high school, it was easily denied because it could be argued that no Black children could qualify since they hadn't passed the 8th grade that was not offered to them. The principal of Thurman's school took him on as a private pupil and taught him the 8th grade curriculum and demanded that the superintendent in his district allow him to take the 8th grade examination. And the superintendent agreed on the condition that he be allowed to give the examination himself. He did. Thurman passed. 8th grade was added soon after. But at the time, there were only 3 public high schools in all of Florida for Black children. And there were several private church-supported schools, and one of those schools was in Jacksonville, Florida, where a cousin of Thurman's lived. And his cousin said, if he can get into the school, if he's going to come to the school, he can stay with us, and I will give him a meal a day and a room in exchange for chores around the house. So Thurman decided to get himself to Jacksonville, and he borrowed a trunk. And it was a trunk that had no locks or handles, and so he bound it securely in rope, and he took it down to the train station, and he bought himself a ticket to Jacksonville. But the agent who sold him his ticket refused to check the trunk on the ticket because the regulations stipulated that the check must be attached to the trunk handle, not to a rope. The trunk would have to be sent express, and that would cost more money, but Thurman had no money except for $1 and a few cents after purchasing his ticket. In his words, he said, "I sat down on the steps of the railway station and cried my heart out." With his eyes down, he saw a large pair of work shoes come into his field of vision, and he cast upward to see this face of a Black man in overalls and a denim cap. And he told him the story of what had happened. And the man said to him, "If you're trying to get out of this damn town to get an education, the least I can do is help you." The man went to the agent and asked how much the trunk's passage would cost, and he paid it. And when the agent handed him the receipt, he handed it to Thurman, and then without a word, he turned and disappeared down the railroad track. And Thurman never saw him again. What does this story tell us about love and justice? Because the man could have commiserated. He could have shared in kinship over the racist actions of the ticket seller. They could have swapped stories about their experiences of living in the Jim Crow South. He could have taken him out for a meal, maybe, to cheer him up before sending him home, his dreams dashed. But as Moss suggests, the extraordinary power of this story derives from the way that it combines love and justice. It would have been loving, but not an act of justice, for that stranger at the station to take him out for a meal and to commiserate about life in Jim Crow South. But the danger of love without justice is that it is just sentimental. Love without justice would have taken no lasting action. It would have brought no change. It would not have brought Howard Thurman to high school. It would not have brought Howard Thurman into the sphere of the influence that he was able to have. On the other hand, it would have been the beginning of justice if the stranger at the station had cursed the ticket seller, had found a way to inflict on him the same measure of pain that young Thurman had experienced, and gone to join the political fight against the cruelty of racial segregation. But justice without love can look a little ruthless. The kind of justice that risks continuing the cycle of hatred and reprisal that can tear down a community. Justice without love destroys. So in Otis Moss's words, it was that combination of love and justice that made that story one capable of holding the transformation of a society. That representation of universal love, that even when you don't know someone, it can be the right thing to do to get involved, to restore hope, to notice what needs happening, that is a form of love. To not operate from a space of fear that says it's not for me to get involved, or I think I already know the answer, or all I want to do is make sure that you're okay, pat, pat, sentimentality. But to remain open to the needs and the evidence in front of you and operate from a place of courage and generosity. Because this was also a story about courage. Courage is this act of fulfillment, in the words of the theologian Paul Tillich, an act of fulfillment of our unique callings. We become our most authentic selves by courageously striving towards that which makes us most whole, even if it involves sacrifice. If you can imagine the sacrifice of the man with his work boots who gave his money to send Howard Thurman's trunk to Jacksonville. Courage is the affirmation of one's essential nature, and sometimes it requires sacrifice. And if we don't sacrifice, that can prevent us from achieving fulfillment, that fulfillment of our authentic self. This is really important for a lot of people to hear, I think. That courage is not just doing the right thing when nobody's noticing, or doing the right thing when it feels hard, but possibly taking one on yourself so that you become a better person as a result of it. It is praiseworthy because that very act of courage is the thing that allows us to get past what is preventing us from being our most authentic self. And courage and anxiety go hand in hand. How many layers of our prism have we uncovered here now? We have love, and we have justice, and we have courage, and we have anxiety. And most of us, on a regular basis, grapple with anxiety, and we need courage to get us through it, and we need love to get us through it, and we need justice to get us through it. We need all of these things. And we know that anxiety is a thing that comes up in our lives in part because the entirety of all of art and literature and religion and music and poetry throughout the ages has dealt with anxiety questions. Questions like, we worry that we're going to die, or that we worry that we're going to have little control over the realities of our lives, or we worry that our lives are meaningless, and we worry that they have no intrinsic worth, or we worry that across the span of our lives we will never achieve our full potential as powerful, life-affirming beings. It's a wonder we ever get out of bed in the morning. In his poem, Vocation, The poet William Stafford remembers a family trip to a place where the grooves cut into the landscape by thousands of covered wagons etching their way across the Oregon Trail are still evident today. The poet uses these scars of historical human migration to unpack tension between his parents, his awareness that within him, he holds this wonder-struck awe of his father and this inherent fear that his mother holds with him. But the poem ends with these words: "Your job is to find what the world is trying to be." Your job is to find what the world is trying to be. What does the world want from us? What are we called to do with that knowledge? I have to skip ahead here. Love and justice and courage and anxiety, vocation. Martin Luther King had this belief that he held it firmly throughout his life, and he preached on it a lot. And it was this belief that humans were capable of extraordinary feats, but they often fell short. And the reason that they often fell short was that they failed to strengthen one of what he thought of as 3 necessary components for a complete life. So take notes. 3 necessary components of a complete life. And the first was a personal component, which was this authentic fulfillment of the self. Tillich's idea of courage, that you cannot be your authentic self if you cannot allow courage to get you past the things that make you want to hold back. To sacrifice something of yourself to make you more happy, that would make you more happy, to enable you to be more authentic. It's this same idea of personal fulfillment that James Luther Adams, who is a famous Unitarian theologian, reminds us is dangerous because we have this intense desire to stay self-focused. We mistake personal achievement for responsible action. I've done good things with my life. Look at my job, my career, my vocation. Things are going well for me and my family. I am being responsible. What James Luther Adams says is that we take seriously only the responsibility of doing our own professional and vocational work well, and that we assume that because we're getting ahead, we're doing it right. It's the same kind of thinking that gets us into prosperity gospel and Jesus loves you if you are rich. And it is mistaking personal success in a small sphere for acting responsibly with our lives, for engaging beyond the small sphere into something bigger. Which brings us to Martin Luther King's second part of a complete human, which is communal, personal, communal. And he said communal was that social engagement and responsibility. This can be challenging for us sometimes because we often feel very, very wounded and incomplete and not whole and convinced that we're going to do it wrong. How can I get into community and do things right if I am broken? How can I get into community and do things right if I feel wounded? But as the writer Rachel Naomi Remen reminds us, it's our very wounds that enable us to make a difference. We are the right people to do action in community just as we are. Our own wounds, our own sufferings enable us to feel compassion for the suffering of others. And if we didn't have our suffering, we would not be able to understand the suffering of others. If we didn't have our loneliness, we would not be able to understand the loneliness of others. We would not be able to find them when they have become lost and sit with them. Part of the challenge of the communal part of this, of course, is the complexity, because how do we weigh all of the different things that are demanding our attention? Just as we have all of those prisms of love that are shooting out, we also have lots of things demanding our attention. Climate change, and understanding of Indigenous rights, and an awareness of systemic oppression, and the need to confront white supremacy. All of these things. Our world is complex, But just because we can only take on one part of it does not mean that we should not take that part on. I have a very vivid memory of walking out of a session at the General Assembly in Portland in 2015. For those who are new to Unitarian Universalism, General Assembly is this big national convention where a whole bunch of UUs get together and pat themselves on the back for being UU. Sort of. It's a lot of fun, you should go. But I walked out of the plenary session and the marriage equality ruling had just been handed down from the Supreme Court. And we were elated. We walked out crying and screaming and hugging each other. People were calling their loved ones and planning marriages. And we walked out and there was a television screen.
The sermon by
On that television screen, President Obama was singing Amazing Grace.
It's the sermon.
Do you remember that experience of elation?
Janet Newton.
And then remembering that at the same time we were memorializing hatred. The response to hatred, I should say. It is a hallmark of spiritual maturity to be able to hold paradox, but it's hard. So I only ever think of marriage equality and hear Amazing Grace in Obama's voice in my head. I think that it is essential for us to remember that whatever small part we can do, whether it is just a piece of glass to hand over or if it can hold all the refractions, it is worth doing. That is what Martin Luther King is inviting us with his second. The last part of his version of a complete person is the spiritual, which he called a sacred kinship with all creation. Within this paradigm, we cannot achieve our complete life without witnessing and living into the full spectrum that emerges from our prism. James Luther Adams said that every personal problem is a social problem and every social problem is a personal problem, and both of those together construct a spiritual problem. We are confronted with spiritual problems in our nation. Everything that we think is social or personal is in fact spiritual. So in order for us to endure the challenges of a lifetime, we must work at all three. We must flex our muscles of authenticity and self-awareness and personal fulfillment. We must be more adept at social engagement and responsibility and sinking deep into spiritual practices that force us into awareness of all of the interdependence and connection that there is among and all of us. We are called to be prisms of love. And that love looks like justice and like boundaries and like generosity and warmth and awareness, like knowing your own limitations, but also leaning into them. Like a belief in your power to do something meaningful about the broken pieces of our world. It is not possible for us to move through our world unless we let ourselves refract and reflect as much light as possible, to be complete beings, beautiful and broken beings. And if we can do this within religious and spiritual community, if we can be a community of prisms, then we can sidestep despair or hopelessness that we may feel if we think that we're doing this by ourselves, because we are not. Look around you. You are not in this alone. We are not alone in the work of refracting love in the world. We are surrounded by people who also believe in this project. Don't get distracted by all you cannot do. Focus on the part that is yours. Focus on what you know is you are capable of. I want to end by reminding you of this. It is impossible for us to move into the world without experiencing anxiety and loneliness, without dealing with economic and political systems that encourage us to buy our way out of that anxiety or to throw ourselves into political projects. It is not possible for us to do that except here. This is the place that's different. This is the place where we leave that behind and we say, there's something bigger at work here, and I want to be a part of it. And I want to know how you want to be a part of it. Please tell me. And I want to know how you want to be a part of it. We all have ways in which we can contribute to the changing of the brokenness in our world. We are all a part of that prism. It is incumbent upon us to grab hold of it and let it start to glow. Amen.